This is now on.
Can you hear me? Okay.
On,
good.
on.
Hi, everybody. Just before we start, there's a very new way of raising questions for the audience during this session. So I'll let Teresa just explain it to you. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Teresa, and I just want to tell you about Slido. It's a way to crowdsource questions. You can join at slido.com and hashtag RightsCon. You can live put questions in as you come up with them, and there's a way to upvote questions and pull them up to the top of the screen. They'll show up as you put them in, and it's pretty easy to use, pretty self-explanatory. The main thing is that you select the cottage, because that's the room that we're in, so that you're not asking questions in one of the other sessions. So make sure you're here in the cottage, and slido.com, hashtag RightsCon.
Thank you very much. And well, I think we can do the cutting edge way, and as well, you can also raise your hand and we'll pass a mic. But try both. So I'll give this one back to you. Okay, can you hear me well? All right. All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Nicolas Saylor. I'm a for the past 2 years. It seems there's barely been a month or weeks without news of a massive data breach. I'll just give you a few examples that you might be really aware of. In 2015, Anthem, a health insurance company, had a data breach affecting 80 million people. In the past 12 months, TalkTalk, a telecom company, had 3 hacks affecting personal data that was used to commit fraud. It is said that they had up to 83 million US dollars in damages to customers. In 2013, Target had a breach that affected 110 million customers in the US, and that led to nearly 148 million US dollars in costs dealing with the fallout. OPM, Office of Personal Management in the US, data from over 20 million public servants was leaked. It's the largest data breach of government data in the history of the United States. And there are many more examples. So theft of personal data is not unusual anymore. On a regular basis, tens of millions of data is stolen over networks about people. And that's data that people expected to be safe. At the 2015 Black Hat conference, there was a survey of attendees, and 73% expected to be hacked over the next year. So it's really becoming a sort of fact of dealing with data nowadays. Clearly, it's very easy nowadays to gather data, personal data. It seems it's not as easy and not as done to protect that data. And as every company basically becomes a digital company, the issue of securing personal data is not anymore the sole responsibility and stake of IT professionals, but across a whole set of new industries. So clearly there is no absolute security, especially on an open internet. That's a network of networks, a lot of complexity in the networks, a lot of different responsibilities. But it seems that in several of the biggest data hacks that I mentioned, the level of security measures to secure that data were not up to the highest standards. So why is that? I mean, that's one of the core questions of the conference. One could assume that the perspective of economic fallout following a data breach would push those companies or administrations to put higher levels of protection. So why is that not the case? In this panel, we're going to explore a few hypotheses around that. For example, is the cost of a data breach lower than the benefits of gathering data? What is that cost, actually? Are there differences of security practices between sort of pure ICT players and other companies or organizations that are not ICT players but that have an ICT component to them, like a public administration, like a bank, like health insurance? Is data gathering itself becoming a dangerous asset, not only for users but also for companies? And if the economic consequences of a data breach are not enough, how can we do better? So these are some of the hypotheses we're going to cover with a very distinguished panel here that I would like to introduce. We have on the right Bruce Schneier, CDO of Resilient Systems, famous cryptographer, security and privacy expert, author. Thank you, Bruce, for agreeing to join us on this panel. Next to Bruce, Mike Nelson, working on public policy issues at Cloudflare, also teacher at Georgetown University. Thank you, Mike, for joining the session. On my left, Drew Mitnick is a policy counsel at Access Now, host of the conference. Thank you, Drew, for joining as well. And finally, on the very left, Priya Kumar, who is a research analyst at Ranking Digital Rights, that basically assesses companies' performance in reaching human rights objectives. So, before we start, just feel free to think about questions. Again, as I said, you have the two options, the Slido one or the regular raise your hand method. So we'll open the floor regularly for questions from the audience. So first question, again, it seems that 2015 has been the year of data breaches. I mean, clearly it feels this way in the news that people could read. Do you think that there's actually an increasing trend in the number of massive data breaches, or is it more a perception that it's maybe because it's reported more in the media? Basically, do we have a trend upwards, or are there other factors?
So there is actually data on this, and it does seem that this is more of a media trend than a trend. And not to minimize the problem, not that it's better than we think, that it's always been this bad. And there's just more reporting about it, there are more stories. There is a trend towards larger breaches, and that's probably just a matter of the fact that there are just larger databases out there. But it doesn't seem like 2015 is the year of the breach, it's the year of the story about the breach, which is good. I mean, we should take this as positive, because when there are stories, when there is such media attention is when we can actually do something about it. But it does seem more perception than reality that it's getting worse. It's always been this bad.
Do you feel that companies are open to disclose data breaches? I was reading an article about, it seems some executives are not always keen to disclose that a data breach has happened because they don't think it could affect stock prices, or it's not useful for other reasons.
In some cases, they don't have a choice. There are a number of state laws, and there's talk about a federal law that would require data breach notification. We see other countries where companies are under pressure to be more transparent. But I think the real trend is just that companies are starting to realize that there's nothing worse than trying to hide something like this. And it's not just about security breaches, it's also about reliability problems. If your network goes down, you want to let people know immediately that you know what's going on and you're working on it and what you're going to do. It's the only way that you build trust in this digital economy. And that's, I think, a good trend. Bruce put his finger on it. Transparency is the answer here. That's what's going to drive companies to do a better job of protecting our data that they're processing and holding.
Do you see companies being transparent about data breaches? Or?
So they're transparent in the sense that data breach, as Mike said, data breach laws require them to be, but there should be more transparency. One thing that we've advocated for at Access Now is a federal standard that sets a baseline. It doesn't supersede stronger state level standards. So if states want to experiment with different windows in which they have to report the breach, or different triggers for what type of data requires a notification, then states would be able to do that. But setting a federal standard, I think, would be a significant boost to kind of the general goal of bringing transparency to data breaches.
And I'll add to that. I'll add to that in the spirit of transparency. Part of what we did with Ranking Digital Rights was look at the degree to which companies, so we looked at 16 companies from around the world, 8 telcos and 8 internet companies, and we looked at the extent to which they're disclosing information about their security practices. So not specifically focused on data breaches, but things like, do they disclose that they have systems in place to monitor employee access? Do they disclose that they do regular security audits? That type of thing. But we also looked at transparency about company practices on what user data are they collecting, what user information are they collecting, what are they sharing, what are they retaining, do users have access to that data? Because I think that speaks to the other side of the coin. It's not just when the data gets breached, it's also what data does this company have on the users? Why is it such an attractive data set to hack into? And that's where we saw a lot of, there is a lot of disclosure on those questions, but the disclosure is very difficult to understand. And I think that's a big problem as well. So users aren't completely aware of what data the companies have on them in the first place.
And as we said in the beginning, obviously there's this sort of category of companies which is, again, sort of pure ICT services like Cloudflare, Google, etc. Does your research also cover companies that are in the health insurance sector or public administration or banking, automobile, etc.?
So we only looked at ICT companies, so internet and telecommunications companies. But I think the broader question or the point here that all companies are dealing with a lot of user data. So this is absolutely something that all companies should be thinking about, not just ICT companies.
But more and more companies are relying upon cloud providers to take the data, store the data, process the data, protect the data. So you're obviously starting off at the right place. And this is a good news story. The fact that small and medium-sized companies are turning to cloud providers who have world-class security engineers developing the best possible systems is a good thing, because it means that these smaller companies that never really had the expertise needed to secure their data are going to be able to do it, and often at less cost. And they're also improving the reliability of their network by using these cloud platforms.
And I think it's also, I think it even goes beyond just the ICT companies and even those non-traditional ICT companies, the banking companies and the car companies. So just anecdotally, when I first arrived in San Francisco on Sunday, I was at a bar watching college basketball, and a gentleman was there who asked me what I do for a living, and I was telling him about working on privacy, and he said, "Oh, that's really interesting. So I am a facilities manager at a facility that provides services to some of San Francisco's underserved." And he said, "I've actually been wanting to talk to someone about this. I've recently started collecting more data on my residents." Mm-hmm. And so we started having a conversation about, okay, why are you collecting the data? What is your goal? Is it really serving a purpose, or are you doing it because you kind of can? And I think in having that conversation, hopefully we illuminated some of that, at least the thought process about, okay, it was a very small organization, but they'd seen this trend of collecting data, and I think there needs to be a broader sweep in the entities that we're talking about. It's not just the big players and the car companies. It's almost ubiquitous now that companies are collecting some user data.
So you raised two very important points I wanted to cover in the session, so I think we can talk about that first. So let's pick on one. You said it seems very easy for even small companies nowadays to gather data. Do you guys think many companies are gathering too much data that they don't necessarily use, and are they taking a risk by doing that?
So I actually think every company's collecting too much data, and they're all taking a risk. mean, this is the promise of big data. Collect it all, because you might as well. It is so cheap to collect. It is so cheap to save. Right? And as the price of doing something goes down, the marginal utility of doing it commensurately goes down. So even if there's a tiny differential value, you might as well collect it. This is what big data promises. Right? Collect it all, figure out how to use it later. And that's only true if there is actually no cost to collection, to storage, to processing. And what we're learning is that there is. I wrote an essay a couple of months ago, which I titled provocatively, Data is a Toxic Asset. That it turns out there is a cost to collecting it and to saving it. And whether it's a small, medium-sized company or a large company or a cloud provider, they are taking on risk when they are collecting data. Now, it's not a lot of risk because we really don't have a good liability regime right now. Right? If, I'm going to make this up, Nordstrom's, where I happened to visit yesterday, they collect my data. If they save it and they lose it, it's very hard for me to get damages from that company because it's very hard to connect the data loss with any fraud. It's hard for me to know in some instances if they did lose something. Oh, it's California now, so I will more likely to know. But there really are risks, and I think we are still basically punch drunk on data. That we believe that it's all going to be valuable and we save it all and we keep it because who knows. And I think we have to change that notion. That yes, data is valuable, but it's also it's toxic. So if you keep it, you have to treat it like a toxic asset. Take only what you need, store it for only the time you need it, dispose of it properly. And yes, you'll be sort of a better citizen, but I think it actually is smarter business. And I suspect we're reaching the hump of that, where the big data hype will go down. We recognize that, yes, we should save some things and not other things.
If I can just chime in with a case study.
And just, I mean, before you jump in, just adding a fact about what you just mentioned. When there is a risk, there is an insurance, usually, right? And I was just reading that cybersecurity insurance rates for retailers went up 32% in the first half of 2015. So, that might be an indicator that...
And that's it, because that's a cost now. We just need the true cost to be reflected when people save data, which we don't really have yet. Insurance liability is going to be one of those. And looking bad on a ranking, that's a real PR cost. So what you're doing is very valuable, because the more transparency, the better companies are going to behave.
Mm-hmm. So let's dig further in the cost issue afterwards. Mike, please.
Cloudflare is a good example of this. We not only deal with huge amounts of big data, we deal with something I call BIF mud. Big, fast, messy, unstructured, distributed data, which is a lot harder to deal with than just regular old big data, which can sit in one or two places. We have 100 data centers around the world which route traffic and try to eliminate distributed denial of service attacks that can affect the 4 million customers we protect. So every day we are processing terabytes of data that go through our networks. It's very fast moving, fast changing data. It's in many different locations. And it's very expensive if we were to just try to capture all that and keep it. So we do throw away. Our core competency is throwing away massive amounts of data after we've processed it and figured out where the attacks are coming from. So our whole business model is about taking the big data and getting rid of most of it to get those nuggets of information that help us protect our customers better. But one of the other things that we worry about, and which I think ISPs are going to worry about more and more, is that they're being forced to collect data by governments. There's a lot of discussion about these data retention laws. They're going to require ISPs in Europe and elsewhere to track all the websites that all their customers visit and hold on to that data for months, in some cases years. I mean, that is a huge problem, a huge privacy risk, and also an added expense. Our company does a great job of doing everything very cheaply. We're able to provide this distributed denial of service attack protection and provide end-to-end encryption at very low cost. Most of our customers don't pay us anything. We couldn't do that if we were somehow being required by governments to hoard these huge terabytes of data that go through our system every day. And so we have to understand the trade-offs here. We have to understand the implications of some of these laws that are being proposed, particularly in Europe, for massive amounts of data retention, which would be, as I say, a serious threat to privacy around the world.
Okay, so keeping data too long can be a risk, whether from a government ask or by a company decision. Do you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, sure. So Bruce mentioned the failure of the current liability regime in actually serving as a deterrent for collecting or storing data. In some cases when we talk about things like credit card data, that's something that is fairly quantifiable, and there's financial numbers associated with the value of those credit card numbers, and the companies often cover it. But one thing I think often missing from the conversations is what happens if that personal data is a photo, is a personal photo. We had the Ashley Madison hack, and it was easy to kind of poke fun of the absurdity of that situation. But what if it's OkCupid next time? That's not quite as funny. It's personal, and that is the information that people care more about losing. And I think it's very possible it's going to be more of what will be taken from databases in the future.
Yeah.
And so I think it's particularly important that whatever legal regime is in place to protect personal data, it considers not only whether it's relevant for financial purposes, but what is the personal impact on the user in a broader sense.
Yeah. No, that's an important question. And before going to you, Priya, open question. I mean, should there be a different level of responsibility depending on the level of sensitivity of that data? For example, health data. I think in the offline world in the US, there are something called HIPAA regulations that say, if you deal with that type of data, you have a greater responsibility. But Priya first and others, please jump in.
Sure. So you're right in that there are certain cases where the laws are saying that a company, for example, with HIPAA and health information, that the laws are a little more prescriptive in how to deal with that information. But part of what we did in our research is we consulted a lot of academic work and other work that privacy researchers and experts have done on what is personal information, looking at personally identifiable information, and we actually used a term called we use the term user information, and we defined it essentially as any piece of information that can be connected to the user. And this was a much broader definition than especially companies tended to use in their own privacy policies. So when we were looking at the privacy policies of the different companies, we noticed that they were using terms like, personal information, personally identifiable information, but it became very difficult to understand what specifically they were referring to. And I'll say, companies tended to be they disclosed quite a bit of information about what they collected, but when we asked or when we looked at what they're sharing, all of a sudden they started using much broader catch-all terms like personal information or sensitive personal information, and then it starts to become a lot less clear what exactly is the company doing. And so while it is obviously understandable, certain pieces of information like, my social security number or what I talk about with my doctor, those are very sensitive pieces of information. But I think what Drew was saying, especially about when we're thinking about everyday users and what they really care most about, yes, I understand that my social security, that 9-digit number is really important, but also the pictures, the content, all of that is data that is out there that companies are holding on to. And so the extent to which we can focus the conversation on a term that's broader, like user information, to encompass the fact that there are so many different types of data that companies are holding.
Thanks. Do you guys want to jump in
so
on the...
There's an idea I've been hearing in the past couple of years, the notion of a fiduciary responsibility. And if you think about it, throughout history, there are examples of groups that we, for whatever reason, have to share very sensitive information with. And because we have to do that for whatever the reason is, we put additional constraints and rules on them. So a priest in a confessional will hear things that can be damaging, And there are rules about what the state can do to compel priests to testify on stuff they hear in a confessional. Doctors, accountants, attorneys, there are fiduciary rules, responsibilities on these groups that have access to very intimate information about us, and we want them to have access to it. We want to be able to talk to them freely without fear. So the question is, can we extend this to information fiduciaries? I mean, I want, for a whole lot of reasons, I'm going to make this up, to give Google a lot of my information. My email, my documents, my address book, my calendar, my photos, lots and lots of things. But because of that relationship, I need to be able to trust them. So perhaps we can invent some fiduciary rules, extra responsibilities on the security they have to provide, extra rules on how they interact with the government and other governments. And I think it's an interesting way of looking at things, because we're moving into a world where we can't help but share, where our information is being collected for very, very good reasons, that we all want to, need to be able to do that safely and securely.
If I can just,
Mike, and then I'll follow up.
I can just say, I think there's a real danger in trying to subdivide the types of data too finely. In the U.S., that's tended to be our tendency. We have one set of rules for your video rental records, but those don't apply to Netflix because those are delivered digitally, even though it's the same damn movie and the same sensitive information. We're now in the middle of a huge fight in Washington because the Federal Communications Commission has decided that internet traffic, after 25 years of saying it wasn't like the telephone, they're now saying it's like the telephone. And so all the rules that have applied to telephone records are now going to be applied to ISP records. In the past, those records would have been fallen under the rules that the Federal Trade Commission had developed. So the FCC is going to try to set up a corresponding set of new rules that will cover ISP records. But it's going to be very hard to decide, okay, what side of the line? You know, because the ISPs are going to start offering services that are going to look more like e-commerce services. And you're going to have the same company under two different privacy regimes and two different security regimes from two different agencies. And so this is a problem I think we're going to have to resolve. We're going to have more generic privacy and security guidelines that apply to a wide range of services, because everything's merging, everything's coming together. It's going to be very hard to see how we can keep up the old style sector-specific regulation.
But so, Mike, my question on that is, in lieu of
all sorts of reasons this is being done, but I don't see that we're going to get any clarity here. We're not actually going to push the ball forward, and we're going to end up with a lot of lawyers making a lot of money trying to draw lines between different services and try to put themselves in one category or the other. I just, given what the FCC's done, they're going to have to come up with these rules, but it would be nice if they could just subcontract to the FTC.
So let's park a bit this question, because that was one of the questions I wanted to have at the end, beyond the U.S.
As we apologize to all the foreign people in the audience for that entire U.S. alphabet soup.
But it was a good case study.
It's a good
and
case,
it's a case study that we're seeing repeated in other countries where people are trying to say, well, this data is somehow more sensitive than that data. It's not. I mean, if you're just sending email to somebody about a health condition, that could be just as sensitive as your doctor's medical record. You're revealing things about yourself just by going to certain websites. And so it's going to be harder and harder, particularly with the Internet of Things, to say this data is not sensitive, that data is sensitive, because you can put the pieces together in very interesting ways and reveal incredibly damaging things about people.
Yeah, no, that sounds, well, there's the technical challenge and what's desirable on a societal level. I'm just going to get back now to the issue of cost. And by the way, thanks for everybody actually using Slido. It's apparently working. So I'll get to those questions really next, and continue to vote for questions you think are the most pertinent. So, I mean, we jump to the question of, is the market are the market mechanisms enough? Do we need regulation, etc.? But before going there, I think we need to take just a step back about, Bruce, you mentioned the cost of a data breach. And I think it's not easy to quantify. And I wanted to ask you guys, I mean, what do you think is that cost? I mean, is there a cost on the reputation of a company? Could it have an impact on the stock prices? Which, by the way, I just read an article from Harvard Business Review, and they seem to see that there was not such a big effect on stock prices following a big data breach. So again, I mean, getting back to this notion of, are companies aware of the cost, aware of the risk, and doing something about it? What is that cost from your perspective?
So there are a lot of costs. There have been several studies that show that the long-term effect on stock price is minimal. And I think this is just us getting used to it. When the California disclosure law first came into being, that this happens all the time. So public shaming, which is really a good tool we had, is attenuated in value as the public stops caring. We are seeing, at least in the U.S., an increase in liability costs. The cost to Target Corporation in lawsuits was enormous, and that seems to be rising. So, in a sense, that's a good thing. But the problem we have here are the economic externalities. That if a company loses my data, I suffer huge costs, but the company doesn't. So, for the company's perspective, it's not really relevant in their calculus. And only if I can somehow move that cost back into the company. And the two basic ways are liabilities, I can sue them, and regulation. The government will fine them. And those are the two major ways we have in our society for bringing in externalities. And we're getting better at them, but still, a lot of this stuff happens in secret. There are a couple of thousand companies that collect my data out there in the big world, data brokers. I have no business relationship with them, but I can't fire them. I don't even know their names. They lose my data. I probably don't hear about it. I certainly don't know the extent of it, because you're right that what data they have is completely opaque. I might get a letter saying they lost some of your data. What was it? And it's true. Was it financial data, which may be correctable? Was it dating site data? Was it photos, email between me and a doctor or a loved one? I mean, you're hearing a lot of different types of data, and some of these costs are very squishy. So it's tough. It's tough to get companies to take it seriously, because a lot of these costs, they are not suffering. They are externalities to them. Right? It's like company pollutes a river, people downstream die. Company, it doesn't affect the company.
I almost never disagree.
And thanks for bringing the concept of externalities, because that was what I was going to ask as well. Who is bearing the consequences of that?
We are.
I almost never disagree with Bruce, but here I will.
It's always a prelude.
So if Cloudflare is hacked tomorrow, what do you?
No, don't use Cloudflare as an example again.
Cloudflare, we're not collecting customer data, so we're not nearly as vulnerable as some. But I would just disagree on 2 points. One is you can have a personal relationship with some of these data brokers. One of them, Axion, will actually tell you what data they've got on you. I think they have a website.
It's an odd definition of personal relationship.
It's not. But at least you can interact and find out more about what they have.
You know their name. It's the ones you don't know.
Well, that's true. But they do have. I think it's called What's My Data. There's a website they've set up for that purpose. Of course, you have to reveal more data about yourself to get that data, because they want to affirm that you are actually the person.
So it's a dysfunctional personal relationship with this company, you're saying?
I didn't say it was ideal. But the other thing I would say is that there has been a major change just in the last couple of years at the board level and the CEO level because of one case, and that is the Sony breach, which not only revealed customer data, it revealed all these emails that were going between top executives at Sony, and in some cases between top executives at Sony and their movie stars that they contract with. And that really changed the discussion in boardrooms around the country, particularly when the Sony CEO had to step down.
So you need to shame a CEO for them.
It's now personal. I mean, people, it really did, that really woke people up, because it went beyond a bunch of numbers and a bunch of customer data. It was hackers getting access to the inner workings of the company and CEOs having to resign because of it. And so that's another form of shaming, and I think it's going to be one that will drive more companies to take more action.
And this might be self-evident, but it's been shown that those companies that do have executive level involvement in security have a lower risk of data breach. So it's important too.
That's a very important point, and actually I was going to ask, this question of, is there a difference of security culture within organizations, again, like Silicon Valley based, of course, securing data is part of, I guess the whole management chain, but there are the cases you mentioned, and also there's I should mention the name or not, but a telecom company in the UK that was hacked several times, and the CEO actually said in the press that she didn't know whether the data of customers was.
Was that TalkTalk? Yeah, you can mention company names here. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, that was this company, and there are many others where it seems that there was not that same level of awareness on the importance of security across the whole chain. So do you think there is a difference, and do you think that's changing because of the media attention, for example?
So again, we only looked at ICT companies, but I think there is a conversation to be had, because on the one hand, where there's the practices that the companies have, and then on the other hand, there's the disclosure that they have. And so we, in our project, our project is based on publicly available information, and the idea is, if I'm a user and I want to understand what the company is doing, the only way that I can do that is by looking at what they have publicly available. And so understandably, when it comes to security, obviously you're not going to publish every single thing that you do, but we were looking for the companies that we evaluated at least to disclose at least the basic things that I had mentioned earlier. Do they have systems in place to limit the employee access? Are they doing security audits? And then other features related to encryption and other security standards that they use. And what we actually found was, we looked at major ICT companies, and it was difficult to get a sense. It was difficult to find disclosure that said just that. They had information that talked all about their security teams and what they're doing, but at least when it comes to these types of specific practices, in some cases we struggled to find disclosure that said those basic facts. So I think there's definitely a conversation to be had about, obviously what's most important is that companies have good practices, but when it comes to users deciding where they want to go or which companies they want to use, which I'm seeing a lot of that in some of these questions, users want to know they want to know that they can trust this company. They want to know what the companies are doing to the extent that the companies can say that. And in that case, the users aren't going to know unless companies are talking about what they're doing.
One extra challenge that you face is that companies are relying more and more for third parties to provide certain parts of their infrastructure. And so Cloudflare is only about 260 people. But that's because we're able to hire somebody else to run a lot of our HR for our employees, and we do a billing system with somebody else, and those might change over time. So you have the task of not only evaluating a company, but all of the major contractors that they work with that might be handling that data. So it's a real jigsaw puzzle. But again, the good news is that those third-party contractors are being assessed very rigorously by hundreds of their customers to make sure that personal data or the employee data is being protected. So there's a nice virtuous circle as we move to the cloud. And I think that the Sony hack in particular has caused a lot of people to turn over these core IT functions to somebody else, because they realize they're not going to be able to stay at the leading edge. They're not going to stay ahead of the hackers as well as Gmail or Microsoft or Amazon can do.
So bouncing on that, and you mentioned audits, and actually when you think about companies, they usually have requirements for financial audits, for example. Do you think that should be the same for security? Or
well, again, it's really tough when you come to the company and you say, okay, how are you protecting this data? And the company says, oh, well, we let this company do that for us. So, it's not as simple as just doing one set of the books, which is what you do for the financial audits. I'd be interested in Bruce's opinion on security audits and how well you've seen them work or not work.
Like everything else, they're good and bad. But this is an interesting phenomenon you're seeing because a lot of this risk flows downhill. So you might be outsourcing your processing to one company, you're outsourcing the storage to another company who's outsourcing their actual physical infrastructure to another company. So it's like 6 companies down the line, and your security is dependent on all of them. And right now, I don't know if you call Google and say, I want to audit your security, what they say is no, go away. Right? We don't need you as a customer that bad. Right? So that is their security policy that they will tell you is you have to trust us blindly and hope for the best. Now, if you're a smaller company, you can't get away with that. You have to actually do some auditing for your customers. But as you get bigger, you have more power there. And so I think we need, just like we have financial disclosures and rules in that space, we need similar rules in the security space. And that these audits flow downhill, that the rack space audit flows downhill all the way to me as provider of some kind of high-end service because I eventually am using that. And you see the similar thing happening in the financial industry. I mean, this is hard. There was a question. No, there's a question up there that hit this that's not there anymore. But how do you get people to care? How do you get the markets to work? We have serious market failures here. I mean, the reason that you don't know about what data companies have on you, that you don't know about breaches unless you're forced to by law, is that companies don't want to tell you. I mean, they don't want you to know. They don't want you to make decisions based on these things. They would much rather duck it. I mean, ranking digital rights is not making friends, right? Because it's forcing transparency on people who don't want the transparency. But it's essential transparency. But transparency alone is not going to work. You actually need oversight and accountability. Right? CEOs getting fired, great accountability. Right? People getting fined, people getting sued. This is how that system works.
And is the market dynamics, are there enough? That's an open question.
Not a chance.
Getting to the questions in Slido, I mean, you raised it, Bruce, with so much breach news, consumers have breach fatigue, feel powerless and ignore it. How to get consumers to know, care enough to cause companies to change? That's one of the most upvoted questions. I'll just raise a second, one or two more. Could establishing a set of standards with specific grades of protection in order for users to at least know how collected data is treated be useful, I guess. Is there a sense that companies are collecting so much data that they are actually losing track of the kinds of data they are treating? And I guess that was your point as well, that you're not even sure.
You have to be in the business of asking those questions. Do I really need this data? But in most cases, the data is going to be collected. And in some cases, governments are telling companies they have to collect the data and keep it. Certainly the financial industry, if you're at all involved in selling stocks or bonds, you have huge amounts of information that you are required by law to retain for many years, just so that you can document what deals, what customers bought. A lot of that's sensitive data. So there's a lot of cases where we see around the world where government regulation are running into each other. One side is saying, collect this data for law enforcement purposes or because of financial regulation, and then somebody else is saying exactly the opposite. Dispose of this data, don't hold it for longer than 3 months. So there's a lot of confusion. There's no coordination in most governments.
Is the landscape confusing for companies, you think?
So I want to ask you, when you're doing this ranking, who do you feel is your end customer? Are you doing it for consumers? Are you doing it for regulators? Are you doing it for the press? Sort of who do you have in mind? Because that's really the question. Here you are producing this data, this transparent data, and can consumers actually use it? Or so what's the end game? Where are we going with this?
Sure. And so all of the data that we've produced in our methodology and all of our results are all available on the website. So certainly we welcome and encourage consumers to use it and the media to use it. But I think our goal is really we, in creating our methodology, wanted to provide companies themselves with a roadmap. So, this is what, if you're interested in making sure that you're doing well and respecting users' rights, well, are you doing all of these things? And a core part of our research process is we've engaged with several stakeholders in all sorts of different ways, but we've been engaging with the companies. So a couple of years ago, when the methodology was in the works, we invited companies to provide feedback on it. Obviously, we didn't take all of their suggestions, but we heard them. And then while we were doing the research, we created the draft, we looked up the draft results, reviewed them, and we sent them to the company saying, if you've seen any errors or if you want to talk about this, let us know. And of the 16 companies that we ranked in the first ranking that was released last November, 9 of them engaged with us in some way, whether providing written feedback or getting on a conference call. And again, there were times when they said, oh, well, actually, we've got this disclosure on this website that relates to your indicator, and we reviewed it and said, okay, fine, yeah. And obviously, there were other situations where companies said, well, I can tell you that we do X practice, internally, but that's not a document that's public. And we, given our research methodology, said, well, we can't give you any credit for that. And so our goal is really, and then since then we've been engaging with the companies. So we would like to help companies understand this, because certainly, these are complex things we're talking about. And also providing information that can help civil society. So especially, organizations that are trying to do company advocacy. Because I think one of the major motivations for the work that we were doing is, and I think, Michael, you've talked about this a lot, it is confusing sometimes. Our company, is it the government that's requiring a company to do something, or is this the company deciding this is what we want to do? And for civil society and for other, advocates to be able to understand, okay, well, where is the pressure coming from? Because it is true that in some, if the government is telling a company you have to retain the data for X amount of time, what we're looking at is, are you, company, disclosing that time frame to the public? But obviously, in that case, the company didn't maybe have a say in that, but at least people who are unhappy with that, they know where to go. And if companies are hearing enough pressure, they can also, inform the government or lobby or things like that to say, yeah, this is not good for business. And so part of the goal is to help clarify where the responsibility lies. I mean, we're called the Corporate Accountability Index, so we want to be able to help people who want to go to the companies and pressure them to be able to do that. I think the goal is that, if a lot of the questions that I'm seeing up here are definitely what can users do. And I think that there are some really big questions there that far exceed the scope of what we're doing, but I think are related to what we're talking about here. Because, for the research, I sat there and I read terms of service and privacy policies. I don't do that whenever I sign up for a new service. I don't think a lot of us do. And I think that is sort of the one elephant in a lot of these conversations, is that it is extremely important for there to be clearer disclosure and clearer transparency. I also don't know that companies are going to do that, because one of the things that we said was, if I went to Microsoft or Google and said, I want to see sort of a dossier of everything that you have on me, I would like to be able to understand what's in that document. I imagine if a lot of us saw that, we'd be pretty afraid, and we wouldn't realize the scope of something like that. And so, how can it may, in some cases it might not, the companies may not want to be clear, but on the other hand, are users going to read that and then decide, I'm going to stop using this service? Because it is complicated and it is overwhelming.
I think you've really hit an important point, though, and that is making it relatively simple. I mean, you look at the movie rating system, right? You can't give people 7 numbers. You have to give them a grade. And having an analogy to point to is incredibly valuable. I learned that when I was in Congress, both for the general public and for reporters and for policymakers. And I think what you're trying to do is very similar to some of the environmental rankings that have been developed over the years. Not everybody factors those into account, particularly when they can save $5 if they buy the more polluting version of a product. Another example is labor practices. We've seen a number of rating systems that try to highlight those clothing manufacturers in particular that are abiding by the best practices in their factories overseas. But at the end of the day, your report is mostly going to be useful and have the most impact if millions of people start making decisions about what company to go with based on the rankings you're providing. I think the real impact will be when what you're doing gets factored into consumer reports and some other general purpose consumer guides that a lot of people use when they decide whether to buy this ISP or that ISP, or to go with this email service or that one.
And one thing I forgot to add was investors,
Yes.
because they can put pressure on companies. So the extent to which we can provide information to help them understand how, when they're thinking about making investment decisions, looking at security practices, privacy practices.
Yeah, we're competing with a very good panel of investors talking about those issues, and one of our investors is on that panel, so I hope it's being recorded so I can watch it later.
So basically, if the cost coming from market pressure is to be effective, it is based on transparency and also users' awareness of what companies do. I mean, I guess
You can't possibly have consumers can't make decisions on factors they don't know, right? I mean, if the food tonight will poison you in 10 years and the restaurant doesn't disclose it, you have no way of knowing that. Period. Done.
there's a great question in Slido. I don't know if any of you know, but are there any companies out there that are already taking the lead in talking about dialing back the data that they collect and store?
I haven't heard of any that are you have like a DuckDuckGo, right, a search engine that doesn't collect individual data, but that really feels like an exception. I can't think of companies in the retail space or in sort of other spaces that just say, we just don't save your data. I can't think of any.
And there's
They
also
can't be none. But the fact that we can't think of any, I think, is telling of how that really isn't considered a valuable market differentiator.
Well, it's also interesting to look at those startups that have tried to address that need. We've seen that first maybe 10 years ago with various identity services that were promising to be your identity broker and to let you buy things without divulging everything about yourself. Those failed. Some of the new social media platforms that grew up in response to the feeling that Facebook and Twitter were collecting too much data, they haven't gotten traction. It only seems to be about 1 or 2% of the American public that will actually spend more money to get more privacy. And I think there's an even smaller number that will spend more money to get more security because, as you said, they don't know. They can't make those assessments. It won't be until we put it into a larger context and we rank security, reliability, maybe labor practices. There are companies that are being rated now as particularly good places to work, and so that gives people a warm feeling about spending money with them.
Okay. Question from the audience.
So I was actually going to tack that on. I was actually thinking that in terms of Bruce's idea that these are toxic assets. I mean, are there any companies talking within each other and sort of within the industry? I agree. We've gotten to this point where we've opened this Pandora's box. All this data is out there, and it feels like there would have to be some sort of discussion in the industry about, this is also possibly a liability for us. But it just sounds like the incentive is just not there.
Not yet.
Yeah.
And do you think the increasing trend of data breaches or reports about them could change?
I think it is. I think you're right that the Sony case was a big deal because it personally embarrassed CEOs, and with our sort of trend in society to sort of promote sociopaths into that role, that this is like the one counterbalance that has existed. So I still think we were very much in the early days of this backlash. That yes, we're having Sony, yes, we're having increased liability, but we're still not having a real discussion of throw it away, simply because the promise of big data has been so great and so vocal. This is a new technology, it'll transform your industry. Just the hype is so hypey. And the same hype in government. And that's the collect it all mentality from the NSA and GCHQ and others. And it's going to take 5 or so years for people to sort of get sober again and then start actually looking at cost versus benefits at a very real level.
And what about public administrations as well? Because they might, I mean, like OPM, they gather data, and I think in the OPM case, they had data from 10 years ago that wasn't necessarily useful. But, I mean, are public administrations with more e-governance services aware of the risks they are taking in actually gathering citizens' data?
The answer to that's easy. No.
Yeah, there was just a report, I think it was a couple of days ago, and it rated OPM's security practices as worse than last year. OPM has.
Well, why should they bother? It's all been
OPM
stolen already.
Yeah, it's all out there. Yeah, right. So, yeah, and the information that was taken in the OPM breach was the most sensitive. I mean, it was mental health surveys and that sort of stuff, and yet the lesson doesn't seem to have yet been learned.
One thing I want to add, I saw a question up there that referenced resignation, from users' perspective, that there is this sense of, when we sign up for services, we are given a choice in the sense that you are asked if you agree to the terms of service. And then you hit the button because you think, well, if I say no, I'm not going to be able to use the service. But you've been provided the opportunity for a choice, and you've decided. And that's largely the approach that we've taken. I mean, the FTC largely operates on this notice and choice perspective, whereas the perspective of privacy in other areas in Europe and elsewhere around the world is this more sort of privacy is a fundamental right perspective. And so the question about, users are just sort of resigned to the fact that this happens. Joe Turow at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School did a study that I think came out last year that essentially demonstrated this idea of users having choice and being able to choose which provider to go to, and that's not necessarily happening because there is this sense of users are resigned because users don't understand what's going on. They value the convenience of using platforms like these. And so I think that's where I get a little bit frustrated in this idea of, users have the choice. I mean, users need to have the information available to them. There needs to be better transparency and more disclosure, but that cannot be the only thing. And I think we've been talking about some of these options.
Just combining your comments with Nico's last question about public administration. When you sign up for your driver's license, there's no notice and consent. I mean, they've got the monopoly. And we've seen states in the U.S. that took all that data, your photo, your weight, your birthday, and sold it. And that's one of the fundamental pieces of personally identifiable information that can be used to tie together everything else. And here they are selling off that information to data brokers, not only around the U.S., but presumably around the world. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when you think about the power that governments have to demand data from you. And it only gets worse as they start doing what Bruce was talking about, providing more e-government services, collecting, putting up more cameras in the streets. There's going to be all sorts of ways in which people are going to be able to get very sensitive information about our daily habits and our routines.
I think we've seen that the notice and consent regime doesn't work. Right? Certainly because, I'm going to pick on Facebook, when you see a window saying, hi, we've changed our privacy practices, click here to read them. What you see is, I'm an annoying window, click here to make me go away. That's what you see, and that's what you do. And Facebook knows that. I mean, they're not stupid. So the notion that we give consent based on notice just doesn't work. I mean, and it's not just governments where I really can't opt out. I can't opt out of a cell phone. I can't opt out of an email address. I can't opt out of a credit card. I mean, these are tools for living life in the 21st century. And we kid ourselves if we think there is real competition there, especially in things like Facebook with network effects. And we join not because we like Facebook, because if we don't have any friends. And so the motivations just aren't there. We're getting into a world where there's no means of consent. I mean, there are probably cameras in this building. You don't see them. There's been no notice. There's no consent because they're in our environment. A lot of this data collection will be in our environment in a way that we can't meaningfully consent. So a rights-based regime makes a lot more sense than a property-based regime. And so where Europe is moving, that these are rights, that you can't just sign them away, because that ecosystem doesn't work, I think is the end game of this. It'll probably take the U.S. a good decade to get there because we kind of hate this kind of stuff. But we do get there eventually, right? You know, we managed to kick out a lot of really bad things in our society by recognizing that they are rights and not property.
Thanks a lot. I'd like to take a few questions from people in the audience. The gentleman here.
I'm from Consumer Reports. We think that's all out because we want to do we haven't
Oh, thanks, Mike.
Oh, thanks. So I have kind of a really basic question that a lot of people have asked me, which has to do with the resignation question. So last year, every single Social Security number in the world was stolen. Like, everything was stolen. Like, all of my data, it seemed like, because me overlaying, I have Anthem, I'm in the government data. It's just like, okay. But the economy and society has not melted down. So one of the things that people ask me is, like, if so many Social Security numbers were stolen, I mean, identity theft happens, but why wasn't everyone, affected by having money stolen and identity theft? And I've heard various answers to that. Well, maybe they're really just looking for the few people who work at Lockheed Martin and so on. But I'd really like to hear what the answer to that is.
Criminals have to sleep is the answer. There is some rate of crime that has to do with how criminals can operate. And the problem is, if I am a criminal and I want 10 credit card numbers, they don't come in buckets of 10. They come in buckets of 1 million. Right? I can't get 10. I have to steal 1 million. So many more credentials are stolen than are actually used for fraud because the criminals are all working full time and they just don't have any more bandwidth. And the databases are just getting so big that what is stolen is much greater than what is used. It's a basic answer.
Anyone else?
But over
Bob.
a period of years, they'll get around to it. Is one
Well,
of the
but
possible
this data has only limited value. I mean, the credential data. All right, everyone, stop moving. Credential data decays in value. And so when credit card numbers are stolen, they might be replaced in 24 hours. So you have to use them fast, otherwise you don't get to use them at all. So yes, everybody in this room has a credit card in their wallet right now whose number has been stolen. Guaranteed. The likelihood it'll be used is low. And credit card companies are now very good at detecting fraud quickly and shutting off card numbers that are being used for fraud. They shut off them preemptively when they can. They often don't know, but they do shut them off when they're used. So that's the basic reason. It's the economics of crime.
And just very briefly, not all the breaches are about crime. I mean, some of them are state-sponsored attacks, and you're not going to find a quick response in which they try to use your Social Security number for some crime. That's a longer game they're playing.
And I guess the one thing I want to add very briefly on that is also, I was a journalist for a while, and I think it's also about the story. So identity theft is expensive for sure, and it's not something anyone wants to deal with. But yeah, a lot of people whose information is stolen, they may not have to deal with it. But this is an example that's sort of out of left field, but I think it would resonate here. So separately from all of this work that I've done, I did some research on how parents use social media. And so I was interviewing mothers about how they use Facebook to share baby pictures. And the first woman I interviewed, we went through her entire timeline of her 8-month-old son. And she said to me, if I lost this, I don't know what I would do. And she had tears in her eyes because it meant so much to her. And I think that gets back to what Drew was saying about, it's not the data, it's the really personal things that this data means and represents. So the extent to which journalists and others can highlight that's what can be the price of all of this that we're talking about, perhaps that'll help raise more awareness and get people.
Well, in her case, interesting that the loss is not some Chinese government has a copy, but that I don't have a copy, right? That is a reliability, availability threat, not a privacy threat, which I think is real important.
Yes, yeah, but the highlighting, what happens if data gets out, or ways to really humanize the costs of these
Yeah,
things.
and I'm glad you mentioned availability because we spend way too little time on that. It's all about confidentiality, and we need at least as much attention on that and on integrity, making sure somebody hasn't somehow missed with your data.
Picture, what happened?
Thanks, Bob Hinden.
Yeah, to follow up to what you said about the Social Security numbers. So it happened to me. Someone last year tried to file taxes for me, and they tried to change my mailing address to their address to get I assume to get a refund. The IRS, for some reason, decided not to accept it, but I'm waiting to see what happens this year. So this does, may not happen to everyone all the time, but it happened to me, and be careful. It's going to happen to you.
Yeah, so maybe part of the answer to the fatigue question is then wait to see how it plays out in 10 years. I mean, if the trajectory of data collection continues in this exponential rate that we're seeing, then maybe as that data is more sensitive, maybe it's not just about fatigue, and it's about catching up to the realization of what actually is happening to our data and it being abused.
Thanks. Karen, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question about internalizing the negative externality, which seems to be at the heart of a lot of this. So I'm wondering if there's any other models in other sectors or other problems that have proven useful that maybe can shine some light on this. For example, like pollution or environmental protection. Are there any good examples of what has been done to effectively internalize the negative externalities for these things?
And the answer is yes. And a lot of security economists have studied that. I think that the environmental pollution is a good example. The externalities are somewhat similar in the way they play out economically, not in how they work. And the controls are similar. So yes, there's a lot of good research on this.
And I have a colleague who usually likes to do the analogy. They say data is the new oil, but they are very right. I mean, in every sense of it, including the negative externalities as well.
Bacon, that's the better.
I've got a T-shirt that says that. The other example I'd say is in auto safety, and we've got regulation about seat belts and the like, but equally effective, I think, have been reports from Consumer Reports and other auto safety ranking services. There's a lot of people, particularly parents, who will decide to spend more money for a car that's safer based on those rankings. And what we're missing in this area, because it's so much more complicated, is those simple ratings. But we're starting to get there, particularly for the cloud platforms that are underlying so many companies now.
But how do we, should there be a threshold of security protection? I mean, how do we define when a case is negligence or whether it's not the liability of a company?
Well, the FTC has done that. I mean, there have been a number of cases where they've taken people to court and fined them for doing things that were clearly not just not best practices, they were downright worst practices.
And courts are good at this. I mean, this is something that doesn't happen. It's not a matter of we figure out the rules and they're there, that the courts do this iteratively. And they're good at partial liabilities. They're good at figuring out what's reasonable, what's not reasonable. It takes a while. It's a slow human process, not a fast tech process, so it kind of annoys us. But it really is a robust process.
Drew, and then I'll take a last question.
There's proposed legislation. There's been a couple bills that have been floated, not yet with a lot of success, but that would impose some basic.
Don't move.
So there's legislation that's been proposed that would establish basic privacy and security standards that could then be used as a source of recourse in the case of a data breach, if it was shown that the company failed to take some basic level of security precaution.
Okay. One last question from the audience.
I was just going to ask if there's any worry with greater transparency and grading that's available for consumers. If companies or regulators might decide to expect more out of users and consumers, and then the liability might shift from the companies onto the users to make more informed decisions since it's available. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a very real risk. I mean, you bought the lousy router. Too bad. So, but I think we in society need to balance these things. You think in pharmaceuticals. I mean, there is a lot of consumer choice, but the law is you're not allowed to put pharmaceuticals that don't work on the shelves. Right? That there is truth in advertising rules, that there are FDA rules before something can go out on a shelf. So you need both. So yes, I think consumers can make choices and should, but we all expect, we don't even think about it, that when we walk into a drugstore, that everything on the shelf does what it says and is not snake oil. And that's because there's a whole substrate of government under that. I mean, it never occurs to us to worry about dinner tonight. Will the food be poison? We will not even think about it, even though we have lots of consumer choice and we will, walk out of restaurants if they look funny. We truly believe that the government is at the base protecting us. I think you need both.
But I think that comparison goes a couple steps further. I've often compared encryption to antibiotics. You take the antibiotic.
All right, super nerdy here, but we're going
right.
with it.
But we have to know that antibiotics, we have to trust that antibiotics work. And if for some reason they don't work, you could be dead. And with encryption, it's sort of the same. We're putting our faith in this technology that is going to protect us. And if it doesn't work, if it's cracked, we could be dead. And I think this actually comes to the transparency argument after there's a problem. Too often we hear these reports of a company that's hacked, but there's never a discussion. There's never a technical postmortem that says the reason this happened was because. And sometimes companies have contracts with their vendors that say they can't reveal that there was a failure, and that's a real problem. I mean, we should know if there's a particular company's service that failed and led to a breach of 10 million credit card records. That would provide this extra layer of pressure, and I think that would be very helpful.
Thanks a lot. We're going to have to wrap, and I'm going to leave all of you guys a final opportunity. But basically, I mean, my last question would have been, again, do you think market forces and the cost a company could incur would be enough to change security practices? I think the sense I get from this is that it could be a part of it. It could shift some of the practices, but it's not probably enough. So, I mean, what's your thinking? How do you see the landscape evolve in the next few years? Do you think we're going to get to a better stage, and by which means? User pressure, courts, market dynamics?
Well, as long as there's transparency, competition, innovation, and not misguided regulation, I think we can get a long way. We are making progress. We talked a lot about the data breach notification acts. That has been incredibly helpful because that's providing transparency and pressure back on the companies. But more transparency is needed, and I think we need to also think hard about how governments can stop requiring the collection and storage of so much data.
Thanks, Mike. Drew?
Yeah. So I agree with a lot of what Mike just said, and I think legislation could also, in the U.S. and even internationally, can play a part of that in setting standards. I will say that one thing to think about when we talk about data breaches, and it goes back to the story I told earlier about the facility in San Francisco that was collecting information, was that the people that they were collecting it on, and this goes to the theme of this conference, were very vulnerable individuals. Like they were not in a position to challenge that collection, and they were particularly at risk to some form of fraud. And so I would just encourage us to think about the broad implications as we think about things like data breaches.
Thank you very much. Priya?
I agree with what Mike and Drew were saying, and I think obviously we strongly encourage there to be more transparency and more disclosure. And I think EFF's Who Has Your Back ranking is a good example of the role that that evaluating companies and putting pressure on them can have. I mean, they started their that scorecard a couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and it has companies that, companies like to get gold stars, we have learned, and so they will, if you put enough pressure on them, they'll do things because they want those stars, and I think at the end of the day, that's been good for users, and so. Certainly, disclosure and transparency has a role to play, but I think this conversation and all of the questions that have come up has made it evident that that's obviously not the only thing. There's a lot more that has to happen, but more transparency is certainly key.
Priya and Bruce, finally, and what's your sort of prediction for
I'm not
the next 5 years?
I'm not optimistic near term because I think there's some more fundamental issues.
Yeah.
Check, check, check.
There you go. Hi, everyone. My name is Teresa Chinte, and I work at Benetech. Welcome to this session today. I just wanted to let you know about Slido, slido.com, #RightsCon. This is the platform that we're using to crowdsource questions during the session. So you can log in through here, ask questions, you can upvote questions, they'll appear live on the screen, and that'll help our moderator and panelists with answering your questions as we go along.
Yes, good. So thank you everybody for being here, and I'm very honored to moderate this panel with amazing women and friends. I want to thank Mariana Valente from Internet Lab that I had the honor to join the advisory board. It's a vibrant young Brazilian think tank, and they are doing amazing work. And part of one of the lines of work they do is regarding violence against women and how that is translated online, and how the debate is growing or not, and how the debate is characterized or not, and how the debate may actually get some difficult angles sometimes, and even some prejudice. So I think the objective of this panel, we have representatives here from different stakeholders, from government and civil society. I want to thank the presence of all of you guys here today. So how did we define violence against women here? Technologically related violence against women are acts of gender-based violence, either committed or aggravated by the use of ICT. So this is in the description of this panel. But we want to, with this panel and your help, because we also want to hear testimonies from the audience and what you face on your everyday and how your organization works with that, is to move beyond a feminist approach or a gender imbalance approach, and even beyond freedom of expression. So how should we be dealing with these issues today, and what is a framework that's valid? So that's why we're going to hear from this great panel here. We're going to start with Farhan Hussein from Bytes for All PAX 10. Then we're going to go to Mariana Valente from Internet Lab Brazil, Julio Ono from Internet Sem Frontiers Cameroon, Natalie from Charisma, also Natalie Espitia, who also helped to organize this panel, Betsy from the State Department here in the US. So please, let's go. And as we said, you can participate from the audience or also send questions through slido.com.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to start by giving you an introduction of what led to the research. And basically in late 2014, Bytes for All, an Association for Progressive Communications, published a country report on technology-driven gender-based violence. And the report presented a summary of 3 cases that we had identified, which talked about how offline violence transcends into the online sphere and vice versa, sort of expanding our understanding of how we look at violence. And these 3 cases were basically detailed case studies about 3 women who underwent severe violence, like countless other women, except that one thing that was common in all of the 3 women was that technology played a fundamental role in shaping the nature and intensity of violence that happened. So in the interest of time, I'll share only one case briefly where a Karachi-based activist stood next to billboards that contained a lot of hate speech with quotations of scriptures. And they basically, the people who put those billboards up were trying to create a link between how celebrating Valentine's Day is immoral and religiously, problematic. So what she did was that she just stood next to those billboards with another banner that said, come closer and let love happen. That is all. Her gesture was taken quite tolerantly by people looking at her campaigning and protesting this way. But within a day that it got reported by a local newspaper on their website, a massive Twitter trend started, and it lasted for 3 days, essentially alleging that she and the newspaper had committed blasphemy. So she and her colleagues received countless death threats and rape threats, and that forced them all to go offline for weeks. The men who were also involved in this campaign received abuse also, except that it was not as violent or sexual in nature. Rather, the only sexualized violence that the men received was, about their mothers and sisters. So that was sort of the contrast there. So while the newspaper took down the reporting of her protest, quite soon, and they published an apology, the woman was watched for 2 years, and after 2 years, she was shot to death. Her mother was with her, and she also got injured. The other person who was with her at that time was her driver, who survived that day, but a couple of months later, they also shot him because he was an eyewitness. So, this is just one story, but it shows how the harms that come from online incitement of violence and the forwarding of violence, especially when gender is at play, seems to exceed those that come from traditional forms or traditional understanding of what violence against women is. So, moving on, there's a very long discussion and a set of observations that can be made about this, but I want to focus on one aspect that is often left out of conversations such as these, and it is the blaming and the resultant regulation of technology instead of behaviors in online spaces. And to conclude my point here is that an important solution may lie in making corporate intermediaries more responsible in understanding how human rights get trampled in online spaces and how violence spreads uncontrollably through digital mediums, as opposed to how, people say that governments should be handed over this right to take control of technology and regulate it, because governments may not be the best control centers in dealing with gender-based violence, given their track record in dealing with any kind of human rights violations, let alone understanding of technology. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and I have tweeted the report. They have written on a series of cases involving violence against women. Some of the descriptions are incredibly shocking, but I think we have the responsibility to learn more about those cases and then see and understand how they get also translated to other countries. So thank you for that, and moving on, Mariana. I pass the word to you. Mariana is going to present a little bit on the research that she has led in Brazil with Internet Lab and some of those conclusions, checking the case law in Brazil regarding ICT-related violence against women. And go ahead, please.
Okay. So thank you very much, Carol. Thank you for Hannah. I'm very happy that you made this presentation because I'm going to speak more panoramically. We are finishing analyzing the results of a research that we've been developing in the past 15 months, funded by the Ford Foundation. We're about to publish the results. So I'm going to give more like panoramic views about cases of non-consensual intimate images and violence against women in that sense. So I'm really glad that you gave like a specific case because I'm going to speak more about like numbers. So we developed this research about what's commonly referred to as revenge porn. Many people are starting to try to find other names to better name this sort of violence, like non-consensual intimate images. And basically what we did in this research was mapping all the judicial decisions in the Court of Appeals of the state of São Paulo in Brazil relating to breaching intimacy and privacy of women online. And just to, maybe it's important to point that it's the biggest Court of Appeals of Brazil with this problem. Not only how they develop, but the answer that law gives to it. I think the main problem about this method is that you end up not getting the cases that do not go to the judiciary, and especially to the Court of Appeals, but we try to bridge that problem by making several interviews, especially with law enforcement agencies. So just a few results about that research. I think the numbers that we got, 95 decisions, and also the sort of lawsuits that we ended up finding in the Court of Appeals of São Paulo, show us that the problem is more widespread than we had imagined at first. And not only that it's more widespread, but it develops differently than we were imagining at first, especially because of the very high number of cases that didn't involve specifically the spreading of intimate images, but that had to do with extortion, menacing, or even rape related to possessing intimate images. And that sort of shows that this is a problem that doesn't happen only online. And that maybe the approach, and that they are related for her, maybe the approach that only looks to this problem as if it was an online problem is a mistake, because we're talking of cases in which someone possesses an intimate images and uses that to obtain other advantages, but that never necessarily goes online, but it has everything to do with the phenomenon that we're describing. So it's especially unhelpful to frame that into like an online sort of violence only. The second observation I have from those results is that it seems to us, out of reading all these 95 decisions, that the victim strategies is also not we had envisioned at first. So we were really thinking that the strategies would be about criminalizing, and that's not the case. I mean, out of 95 cases, we got 36 that were criminal cases, but 59 were civil. And out of these 59, 43 were directed to OSPs. They were lawsuits requiring the removal of contents. And out of those results, and also out of the interviews we made, especially with lawyers that have been defending these sort of victims, we came to the conclusion that it seems that what victims are most interested in is just having the content removed, not necessarily going to the second step of punishing, especially because that involves a lot of more victimization. We can speak about that later. One third observation is that the problem is clearly worse when it comes to images of teenagers. We have a very protective law in Brazil that's called teenagers were favorable to the aggressor, which was not the case when we were analyzing cases involving adults. And that happened because the way this law frames the issue of intimacy as child pornography is very strict, so it's very easy to fall out of that description. And also because when the aggressor, when the judge understands that the aggression didn't know that the person was under 18 years old, it's very easy that the lawsuit gets dismissed and consent doesn't play a role because it is understood that it shouldn't even play a role in these cases. I mean, even just the act of possessing images should be a problem. So in the end, if the aggressor didn't know or didn't have reasons to know that the victim was under 18, the victim is unprotected by our law. And that can be extremely problematic because when we're speaking about teenagers, we're speaking of the most striking consequences. We have been following several cases of school dropouts, people having to move from their neighborhoods, move from their families because of having those sort of images being exposed. And the fourth and last observation I have about these results is that it seems to us that the judiciary is looking at this problem strictly from an individual standpoint. And that maybe comes from even the very structure of criminalization, of thinking of law only in terms of criminalization. Because when you think of violence strictly as crime, you have to frame the problem within the framework of having an aggressor and having a victim. And you can't really see that this is a social problem. So all lawsuits regarding adult women, they will be lawsuits of crimes against reputation. So that's thought in a strictly individual way. And even though out of the 95 cases, 93 were related to women, not in one decision did a judge say the word gender or say that it was a gender problem or there were gender norms involved. So the problems were always described as a problem with reputation. I mean, gender norms, yes, honor. And gender norms were not brought to the discussion at all. And just a last remark about this, we have a very, I think we have a very interesting law in Brazil to protect women against domestic violence. And it's very interesting in the sense that it deals with public policy and establishing a network of protection, not only thinking of violence in terms of criminalization, but it hasn't been mobilized in the Brazilian judiciary. So that's something maybe for us to discuss, you know, why are we thinking of this problem only in terms of individualizing and of trying to individualize conduct? And the criminalization strategy is maybe the reason for that. So that's it for now.
Thank you, Mariana. I think those are very insightful conversations and thoughts on the role of the government in advancing these rights and even public policies in a broader scale. So talking about government, I want to bring to Julie Ono from Internet Sans Frontiers, and it was very interesting when we were discussing the panel that he said, as usual in the African continent, we see this gap on the discussion and framework between the government action and the citizens' initiative. So let's listen from Julie.
Yes, thank you very much, Carolina. I will echo what was said by our friend from Pakistan and by Mariana a bit earlier. In the case of So, in the African context, and specifically Central African, because Internet Sans Frontières, so Internet Without Borders in English, conducted a study on women's rights online in Cameroon, and and we figured out finally that Internet is a great mirror of inequalities and social issues that exist in our world. But that dimension is not taken into account by our governments, African governments. For instance, in the case of Cameroon, there is an ICT law that represses pedopornography and even same-sex solicitations through ICT, which gives an idea of priorities of the government, but nothing on gender-based violence. And this is surprising because we've conducted a quantitative study among women, and we saw that despite the fact that women are a bit less connected than men, they are the most likely to be victims of gender-based violence, at least violent speeches, being called, names, etc. And on this, I have an example, a very recent example, still Cameroonian. I don't know if some of you know the famous football player, soccer player, Samuel Eto'o. He's a super international star and is accused of revenge porn against one of his mistresses. And the mistress, ex-mistress, published a book called Revenge Porn, and she was the one being called names. Like she's the one being the slut. She was the one being, doing something wrong. So it's quite interesting. And what's interesting is that many of these messages of violent messages came from women, and that I found very preoccupying. And to echo to a question that was asked, whether it's a man issue, not that much. I think it's really a social issue and a question of education. Many women have interiorized the idea that, they're not entitled to certain things, and that, the patriarchy is the norm. And I think that's something that's probably should be stressed on when dealing with gender-based violence and how to fight against it. Yes, on this specific issue, we've seen that despite the fact that most governments do not take actions, there are civil society that are resilient and quite creative, as it is quite often the case in Africa. And I want to give an example of a platform called Pigasimo, which is in Lingala means denounce, if I remember well. Lingala being a language spoken in DRC. It's a platform. What's interesting is that it's a platform that uses a technology called Freedom Phone, which allows you to create campaigns via SMS and to target the population that you'd like to target. And they put that in place, and they send SMSs to women on what's gender-based violence and why why it's wrong, why they are not the ones being wrong, but the one who perpetrates them. And what's also interesting is that they have a hotline behind this also to receive calls and, women who want to denounce what they've been victim of. And I think that's interesting because first it's an Afrofeminist initiative, and I'm insisting on the word because I think feminism has to take into account specificities, cultural specificities. And in the case of Africa, the education is really, really important. The education on the fact that the simple fact that women are entitled to rights, that's something that many still don't take for granted. So it's an Afrofeminist initiative by a collective called Mwasi, and I think it's probably something that could be adapted elsewhere. And I wanted to highlight it here because, again, it proves that civil society can be at the forefront of understanding current issues and probably suggest perspective on these type of issues. And yes, I hope we'll have the time to showcase other interesting examples.
Broadening up a little bit the framework and the narrative, right? I want to also bring to the table the issue of economic growth and development. There are so many statistics already out there that proves that even rudimentary skills of ICT for women contribute to local development. The statistics are just going up and up and up and up in terms of the important role of women in rural communities and other communities that possesses the cell phone or that possesses a rudimentary computer, and how that's important. And I think you guys are all bringing the importance of this sustainable environment and of supportive environment for that. So with that in mind, I wanna bring Natalie Espia from Fundación Carisma from Colombia. She will present on exactly a supporting system project that is the Alerta Machitro project and its background and how the results have been so far. So Natalie, please.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Well, I came to present Alerta Machitrol. It's a campaign. It's not a resource. You're all talking about resource.
Yeah.
But Alerta Machitrol was born for a research that we did together with Web Foundation. So we started to do a joint project with them, and realizing there was a wide and complex matter talking about online violence. We want to focus there on online violence against journalists. And we started to work on that, but when we was time to talk about take action, we decided to do a campaign that was focused on public in general. So Alerta Machitrol is called like that because we wanted to play it with two words that are really familiar in Latin America and here. You all know what is a troll, right? And in Latin America, we use macho to name, and here you're probably familiar with that, to name a guy that thinks that he's the strongest one and the one who can do everything. So we want to put
That's
those...
a nice way to put it.
Yes, that's a nice way to put it, yes. So we want to play with that because all Alerta Machitrol is a campaign that's based on humor. We want to play with that. And it's a counter-speech campaign. That's really important to say. So we put those two words together and we named it Alerta Machitrol. So Alerta Machitrol is a campaign that wants to visualize online violence against women. Okay. So we were trying to play with the idea that we were investigating a new species that is growing on internet. There is the machitrol. So that's why you see a scientist doing that. Sorry, it's not working. Okay. So we're saying that finding a machitrol is really easy. You just had to go online. And then you can find a wide types of machitrol, but we want to focus on two. You can, next one, please. So we put it only two machitrols, the uncurable and the curable. So the curable one is the one that you can talk and you can have a conversation and say, maybe what you're saying is kind of sexist or is misogynist. So we can have a conversation about that. But the uncurable one is the one that has nothing to do. You just say, okay, this guy is just lost in this war and we cannot do anything for that guy. But our campaign is not focused on sending a message to those kind of people, but we realize that not only men do that. Women can be a machitrol too. But we're not focused on sending a message to that, but we are focused on sending a message to the person that is being a victim of online violence, because we want them to know, because we realize that young people don't, and women a lot of times don't realize they are being victims of online violence, because sometimes we naturalize those messages online with a lot of memes. You know what is a meme? Yes. So it's important to say that we're not focused on that. We're focused on sending a counter message. So that's why we are a campaign counter speech, because what we want to do is use humor to spread the word and to produce a lot of content that is saying, okay, this is wrong. This message going through the internet is not okay. It's sexist. Is going against women, is going against our rights. So let's put something really creative, something that we can play with, something that we can have fun with, and use it to talk about this problem that's taking the online war. So how Alerta Machitrol works is, this is the slide. We had two seals, the incurable one and the curable one. So what you do is to do a screenshot, a print of the messages. You can use a message on Facebook, Twitter, whatever social network that you're using, Instagram, or you can maybe do a print of a comment on a media news. We don't accept an email or WhatsApp messages because that's private. We only use the one that are on public. And you took the print and you put the seal that you choose. You can choose between the uncurable and the curable, and you had to explain to us why you think that message is sexist or is doing online violence against women. And then you upload it to the internet, and you can use it to put it on Twitter or on Facebook. So you can say, okay, I had found a machitrol online. So this is the machitrol. Well, it's really. Can you change that one, please? So we had some examples here. This one is a news, and they're doing. You see the seal there, and they say my stores had a great success because I don't hire fat women or ugly people. No.
And
just because I had beautiful people coming. So they put the seal there, and we had another one. And this is really recent. This is all the day we commemorate Women's Day. And they say it turns out that now they don't want flowers, they want rights. Who gets them? So they put the seal there. And the people will put the link or where we can find that, so like the source, and then they explain why it is a machitrol. So you can find this tool, because this is more a tool, but you can find resources at our website. You can find resources to go to how to handle that, no? Because we are doing this as a counter speech, but we want to put resource for women or for LGBTIQ people to use it too, because we realize this is a problem against women, but against to LGBT people too. So you can find it in actua.charisma.org.co/alerta machitrol. So, or you can just Google alerta machitrol or put the hashtag on Twitter or Facebook. I think that's it, and we can have a discussion.
I think it's a wonderful way to do even a shaming campaign.
Totally.
To deal and raise awareness and engage with people you can engage. But moving forward to my dear Betsy, she has been working with human rights forever, and now she's at the State Department working in the Office of Global Women Issue. So she's gonna tell us a little bit what are the battles she's facing nowadays there. Go ahead, please.
Hi, folks. My name is Betsy Brayman, and like Carolina said, I work with the Office of Global Women's Issues at the State Department and have been working on internet freedom with the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor for many years as well. So I have been enmeshed with the issues of gender and freedom of expression and digital security and all of these different issues facing international human rights activists around the world for many years. Just to give you a quick overview, the office that I work for now is really focused on making sure that the perspectives and the understanding of the experiences of women, girls, and LGBT people are very well integrated into U.S. foreign policy. And these are issues that are cross-cutting and also very highly prioritized by President Obama and the current administration when it comes to really making sure that we understand how a gender-based violence lens really fits across a lot of the different issues that we're facing within foreign policy today. And so our office is really focused on helping the rest of the State Department understand and integrate that, and also doing our own diplomatic policy outreach and funding programs and things like this to support those efforts. So today it's really wonderful to be here with this group of activists who are really fighting the good fight locally, providing such amazing examples of how people are creatively engaging, capturing, reporting, and raising awareness about these issues. And you know, as we can see, it's more than just about technology is more than just access. Access is a really complicated thing when it comes to the rights of women and LGBTI people in particular. And when we talk about freedom of expression online, we have to examine whose freedom of expression. Because the current paradigm that we've been dealing with when it comes to freedom of expression online is a privileged paradigm. It has not been including the voices and the experiences of women, girls, LGBTI people, and other groups that are outside of dominant power structures. So we have the opportunity to help evolve that paradigm. And these are people, and you all in this room are a big part of that solution. It makes things more complicated. It makes things harder. But in the end, it's going to be a more inclusive way of understanding and using the internet so that we are able to scale equality instead of inequality, the way that we're kind of facing right now. So there are just a couple things I want to mention here in terms of the ways that our office is thinking about how to conceptualize tech, the internet, and gender. So first of all, a rights-based framing is really important. Gender-based violence online isn't just about freedom of expression. It's about assembly. It's about association. It's about civil rights and political rights and cultural rights. It's about access to justice. So we have to really think about how also that gender-based violence isn't just about women, of course. Gender is all-inclusive. Men have a gender too, and patriarchy hurts everybody. In the short term, it favors men in a lot of ways, but in the long term, it really holds us all back. So a broader rights-based framing is really key to thinking about how do we engage on gender, tech, and online harassment. As we've talked about today, it's really important for us to understand how the online and the offline transcend and inform each other. So that's really key. Another thing that's related to that is the cross-pollination between social movements. The freedom of expression, internet freedom world can sometimes get a bit insular, right? And in order for us to really expand and help other folks working on really important issues around the world to understand, how to be secure online and how these issues about privacy and security are really relevant to their work, we have to move out of these silos, right? So, have the privacy geeks and the anarchist hackers meet the radical feminists, meet the AIDS health workers, meet the abortion providers, the Black Lives Matter protesters, people who are leading tenant associations, working on fair housing. We talked a little bit about economic participation and how that's really important. People who are focused on, sexual and reproductive health and rights. There are so many intersections between these different movements. And if we're going to be able to really move forward in terms of making sure that we're able to have a lot of solidarity and power together as we kind of reshape this paradigm that we're working in, we have to do that together. Along with that, there are all these diverse actors. You have families, you have community and local responses, which we've heard a lot about today that are really, really impressive. Local content and language is really important. Civil society, of course, doing local advocacy, research, the things that we're hearing about today. And then government. Government has a lot of responsibility as well. Talk about law enforcement training, the implementation of laws. I like how you mentioned how the domestic violence laws in Brazil haven't quite yet been harnessed to deal with this issue. That's something that we're facing today. There are some really amazing, very strong domestic violence movements in the United States that have been doing some really important work around online safety. Kind of getting these different movements to talk to each other and work together is really key. And then, of course, business. We have to figure out how to engage businesses better and move that conversation to the next level. And there's a lot of really goodwill in that space. We just have to really problem solve together. So the other really key thing that I'll mention is making sure that within these conversations, we preserve agency and we nix protectionism. That's really, really important when we think about how to frame on gender-based violence online and moving this conversation forward. Because the protectionist argument is often exploited by the repressive governments who want to use the excuses of child porn, moralistic arguments to broadly interpret that for their own political purposes. So those are some general kind of guidelines within our framing that we're using as we think about how to move this conversation forward.
A great contribution on creative ways to actually break silos that exist and then expand this framework has, I think it's the core goal of this panel here with the contribution of each of you. And I think, so now we have around 25 minutes until the end of the panel, and the idea now is to have a ping pong between the audience and the panel. So I have a couple of questions that we discussed, and then I want to be sure that you guys bring some questions too and experiences, and then we go online. So let's see if we can do this three bodies problem type of thing here. So from the online, I think there is something that's really relevant nowadays. So given the gender ratio and developer circles of times, how can women in tech best advocate when doing so can make them internally targeted or othered? I don't even know what's that. How do we deal with gender-based violence in our field? And I think this has been more and more present in some of the discussions also in US and in other fields where targeting women became in US, there was a couple of months ago a big scandal in Nature Bionetworks, and also I think there was something in Uber and so many other examples that are related to that. So I think let's go to that, what we live in our tech policy field, and then grasping from what Betsy was saying, what sort of civil society, private sector projects and partnerships have you heard of, or that we should be developing that exist and do not exist and should exist? So anybody, please jump in. Gender in the field. So let's get a question from the audience, and then we can move on from those questions or comments, experiences. Here, can we give that to her? It's not on.
Hi, my name is Chennai Chin. I'm from Research ICT Africa, based in Cape Town. And I've come from Gender and Internet Governance Exchange from Africa, hosted by APC. And my question is around, I posted it, but I just want for the panelists to respond to this. How do we engage users who are offline but are victims of gender-based violence? For example, you have women having their bad pictures being used as memes, but they're not online. And yet it's circulated, and yet their friends tell them, oh no, go on Facebook, your photo is there. But they don't have an account, and they choose not to have an account. So what are from your different country perspectives, how do you outreach to those women and men? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Okay, so Mariana?
I'd like to comment a bit on that, and also try to frame what you've been speaking of, and put something. I was talking about Farhan about something about this just before starting. I think it's interesting to put into that framework. I think it's really interesting that we have a project of counter speech here, because that's definitely one of the strategies to deal with online violence. And at the same time, I think it becomes pretty clear that it's a limited strategy. I mean, there are cases of a lot of success. I think you're presenting one that's very interesting, using humor. We have a few cases of success in Brazil too, like big campaigns that have really been able to turn the story in favor of the person who had been the victim. And I think there are limits, either if we're speaking of situations that are going on offline, as you're putting, or because the very structure of the society doesn't allow for the discourse to be overturned. So maybe I'd leave to that and also give the floor to Furhan, who was saying some really interesting things about this before we started.
Yes, thanks. So we were having this discussion about how what are the different solutions that could be out there to counter online hate speech, and one which was being discussed was countering online hate speech with more speech. In our context, yes, exactly what you were discussing. In our context, however, we have seen that at times it may not always work the way it is intended. For instance, in online spaces, you see that saner voices, people who support human rights, activists or civil society representatives, always tend to be outnumbered when it comes to addressing these issues, speak and trying to speak out with people who are being abusive. And in one particular case, cyber armies and cyber trolls that are out there sort of form alliances to go and target people, and it can be very hard, especially. And in our region, we've seen that it's very easy to associate anything with blasphemy or religion, and the moment that happens, all hell breaks loose, and it's the immediate safety of the person that comes at threat, such as the instance that was discussed a while ago in the case of the activist who was murdered. So for her, going low profile immediately while waiting for justice was the only option, which is terrible that she had to absolutely sever her online presence. But even that did not really work to her benefit. So yeah, it's a big question mark, and it's something that needs to be understood better. But again, I would still focus on the role of corporate intermediaries as being one that is extremely important, because you see, corporations generate a lot of profit from the data that they gather from us and sell to people, and they get away with it very easily while taking no responsibility of the harms and the violence, the human rights abuses that also happen on the same mediums. And there's just so much more that they can do in this context, which is why that needs to be debated a lot more.
And I think this tied with the question from the audience, from our colleague from Cape Town, because exactly if they are not online, but their information is being used online, how to do it and how we should be asking help from, right? So it would be great if we have anybody from Google, Facebook, or other platforms in the audience to tell us how they deal with it online. But maybe have some boards, even with users, so we don't move to paternalistic solutions like actually happened in Brazil before Marco Civil, when there were a lot of laws criminalizing some actions instead of building a supportive environment. Natalie, you want to comment?
Yeah, I want to say that we actually taking Alerta Machitrol in a place that is going offline to talk about the campaign offline. So we're doing some radio shows at the street, because I'm not only an activist that works with digital rights. I also work doing some cultural stuff. So we mix both it, and we are going to streets, Bogota, Cali, Medellin, and talking about this campaign so people realize when they're being a victim, and they're saying, okay, maybe I'm not online, but we can create a support group of people that is actually online and can help take down that kind of comments. Or support group also can help you, giving you tips and tools and web page that you can use to how to handle that kind of things. So, and doing the prints for Alerta Machitrol is very important. When you do the prints, and you can capture that thing and you can save it, because that's the proof that you are being a victim, and you can use it later.
Always take a print screen, people.
And to comment on your question, I think the way to fight against GBV is to go where, to target offline persons is to go where they are. And on the African continent, what do they use? They use mobile phones. Even in the remote areas, you have mobile networks. And I think organizing campaigns such as like the Pigasimu example that I gave, there are many others certainly, is interesting because yes, it adapts to the market you're talking. I mean, it's not a market. It adapts to the people you're talking to, and it also raises another question, which is not directly linked to this debate, which is how to protect data of people in Africa, and that's another debate that we'll probably have this afternoon. But yes, we need to go where the persons are, and I think there was a question on free speech. I mean, how to fight against GBV and at the same time protect free speech. What interpretation of free speech? It depends what interpretation of free speech you have. Of course, there is always the dichotomy between the US interpretation, which is, okay, you can basically almost say whatever you want, and the civil law system, which says you can do whatever you want until someone else's liberty is affected. And someone else's liberty can start very, very, like the next door. So first, we need to agree what interpretation we give to free speech. And I think that's probably a challenge that we've been having online for certain.
Betsy, and then back to the audience.
I guess I would just note that it's important for us, as we've been talking about today, about how the online and the offline inform each other, for us to not have assumptions that we have to create new things in order to address online violence. So sometimes I think what's really important is to there's a lot of education and awareness and training that has to happen with the infrastructure that's already there, the law enforcement, the service providers that are already there, the different kind of activists that are already on the ground, to help them understand how this intersects with them and how they can adapt and evolve their work in order to include this online experience.
Harnessing and breaking silos that we were discussing. So just a question for the audience. Who here has suffered online violence? Please raise your hands. Have you? So just repeating the question, because this side has not. So who has suffered online violence? Who knows who has suffered online violence? Okay, thanks. So this is very present on our day-by-day life, right? So I would love to hear some testimonies if you are willing to. But Leslie, please, a question for you. Here, there it is.
So,
introduce yourself.
Yes. So I spent most of my career doing free expression, and I'm furious because I think that we have this framed wrong. We've got it somehow framed as free expression for the trolls versus all kinds of power-sapping things about women where, they're abused, where we're using all this language, and we're not. It seems to me that if you're going to talk about rights, we have to talk about our rights. And free expression, the ability to have an equal voice online, is sort of at the heart of this, separate from the kinds of cases that get offline or specifically about reputation. And I feel like we really have to take free expression back. I mean, even in the United States, maybe you can say anything under the Constitution, but the platforms have wide power and do limit all kinds of speech that would be, quote, constitutional. But I think that somehow we give up our power if we only talk about this as victimization, and instead of that, there is sort of our right and our power to participate in a medium that we need for our work, for our families, for our education. So I think we have to be more assertive about the right side of this. In the United States, it's always free expression versus privacy, and it's not entirely clear to me, except for revenge porn, why this is privacy. I mean, we're being pushed offline, and I just think it's more powerful language, and we really have to talk about our voice, that we deserve to hold half the internet and get a bit more aggressive about that.
Thank you very much. I think this is exactly, it's a great frame for exactly what are the goals of these organizations working here. And Mariana, you want to comment on that?
Yes, I wanted to make a quick comment sharing a case that we have been following closely. It's the case of a journalist who wrote a piece about sexism in the nerd environment. And she started receiving a lot of threats online, and some masculinist groups, they found her address, and they started to send things to her address, to her neighbors, and she felt really threatened because they were also sending threats to her family in her own house. And she did a great job at exposing the situation because she was an outspoken journalist, and she wrote a few texts about it, a few articles.
She took the risk.
She took, but at the same time, when she speaks about it, she says, every time I think of writing about sexism again, I think twice. Yes. Because...
Self-censorship.
Yes. Yeah. So maybe that's a good framing for the issue of free speech. And just catching up really quick on what Betsy was saying before about like networks of activists and things that are going on offline, education initiatives. One thing that we also noticed from our research, we developed a case study in the periphery of São Paulo with teenagers that were being exposed in slut-shaming lists, and girls were also going offline because of what was happening to them. We started to investigate the network of support that they had. And we're speaking of a very poor neighborhood in the periphery of São Paulo, in which the presence of the state is mainly schools and a few health community agents.
And heavily armed.
Heavily armed police, and that are mingled with drug trafficking and all sorts of problems that you can imagine. And the teachers in the schools weren't being very supportive of the situations. When we would speak to them, they would be just like blaming the victim and all that. And sometimes it seems to me that we have to look at very at places we didn't suspect before when speaking about these subjects. So one of the places we should look at, it seems to me, in Brazil, is the discussion about education plans. And this has been very polemic in Brazil lately because we have a very, very conservative Congress. And we always used to have inside our educational plans these gender and human rights issues, which have been taken out by the last legislature. So maybe that's a place where this should be discussed, you know, like what should be discussed in schools with these teenagers, with these children, because I think there are several setbacks there, and if that's the presence of state in many places, maybe that's where we should also try to go in through.
And so I think we are all bringing different strategies here, right? There is this bottom-up approach at the community level, but there is this top-down approach from governments and even international organizations, which is something we haven't touched much, but I would love to hear from you guys and from the audience. I'm not seeing anybody from UN or UNESCO here. I know they are here in RightsCon. Because the government set a goal with the Sustainable Development Goals and the WSIS +10 results to bring online 1.5 billion people in less than 10 years. How are we bringing these people online if they arrive online and their image and private and data has already been shamed? Are we going to spread the horrible right to be forgotten style to protect these people, right? Which is like a horrible solution. So I'm not supporting that. I'm just kind of thinking about the collateral effects, the chilling effects of a bad discussion, of if this takes a bad turn. So I think one thing that have appeared here as example is the power of the online community has an immune system, right? If the person is not present, can we, as a community, react to something as an immune system? So again, that's another suggestion. I see a hand over there, and I think we have 5 minutes to close the panel. So if you have a question, it's your turn. Okay, you and then you. Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Charlie Hale. I'm from Pinterest. You had asked a question before about platforms and what they do, and I think this actually goes to your current point about governments. I think oftentimes there isn't certainty from governments around these issues, and so I think revenge porn or non-consensual intimate imagery is a good example. In California, there were, millions of dollars being made by sites that trafficked these types of images, and there was no law until recently to give platforms like us the certainty that we needed to know that that was an illegal act. And so I think in the void around different issues like this, platforms sometimes just have to act. We had kind of banned that kind of imagery on Pinterest a long time ago, a couple of years ago. A lot of platforms, I came from Google, which is a little bit more of a kind of free expression, although I also dislike that dichotomy, where they would want kind of verification that the victim writing in was actually the person in those photos, and we just felt like it didn't really matter because we just don't want, as you said, if we're trying to get another 1.5 billion people online, we have to create the environment that's safe and inclusive and comfortable. So more of just a comment, but wanted to answer your question.
Yeah, so here, and then her. So.
Hi, my name is Sude. I'm Iranian, feminist cyber activist based in Paris. Well, I have different questions for you because we created this Macho Land platform. You might know the name Macho and Land, what it means. We named this platform Macho Land because we want to occupy Macho Land, as we would like to occupy Wall Street too. So I have this question for you. What we basically do is very similar to what you do with the Alerta Macho troll. But do you see any changes? Like, do those macho trolls stop being sexist? Do you see any changes in their behavior? Because what basically we do, we send emails or we send tweets or Facebook messages to that responsible person. That could be a legal person like VOA, BBC, or some personality directly, and we make them to answer us. We actually do spam their emails until they get to answer us and say, sorry, we didn't know that was sexist. We also have that a website is already filtered in Iran, of course, but we also were considered about this sexual harassment among the applications like Telegram and Viber and so on. As you know, like Viber creates some stickers, and those stickers were highly sexist, like in the Iranian sphere. And when we wanted to offer them some feminist stickers or not sexist stickers, they did not accept us. And the Iranian government could actually ban some activists like me, so I cannot have access to Viber on any IP, my name, anything. So I do not exist on Viber anymore because I had this problem. But then at Telegram, we did create a bunch of dozens of stickers against the sexual harassment to say, stop it right now, I don't want it, etc. And that did really work. I mean, just this shaming project is a very good one, but do you also get to make them change their behaviors in their next less sexist behaviors?
Thank you, and I think that ties greatly to a question that we have online. Why is this violence only has a women's issue and not a gender threat to a border free of expression? But there was also another question there before that this should be a man issue too, and it's very funny. In my family, we have this very clear, right? My husband is also in tech policy, and he's the one that do the early pickups and take my son to the circles with his school. Why? Because he's praised as an amazing, wonderful father by everybody around him, while I say, you're going to do the pickup and I'm going to stay late in the work, and because if I leave early, not in my organization right now, but public knowledge, very flexible on that, but in general, people look bad at you, right? When you leave a panel in the middle of the panel because you need to pick up children. So that needs to be a man issue too. We need our partners and our friends to buy into this. And because they will be praised and their salaries will not be smaller. So you have a question there too.
Yeah, hi, my name is Tanmori, and I work on issues of Dalit rights and Adivasi rights in India. And one of the questions I had in terms of strategies had to do with, are there any tools that are being developed or any reports that are being done to not just document the harassment, but to document the perpetrators?